Okay.
Alrighty. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this eShaver webinar event. We are so pleased to have you this evening. My name is Annie Childress. I am the Events and Operations Manager at eShaver Bookseller. I'm going to take you through some housekeeping, and then I'm going to hand it over to Andrew and Wanda. So, I'm going to read through our code of conduct so that everyone knows what is expected of me and of you. Our event provides a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, or religion, or lack thereof. We do not tolerate harassment in any form. Sexual language and imagery are not appropriate. Anyone violating these rules may be expelled from the event without a refund at the discretion of the organizers. This is a non-smoking live event. Please refrain from smoking while on camera if you choose to be on camera. There is going to be a Q&A portion at the end of this event. If you look along the bottom of your screen, there's a little menu with a Q&A portal. If you will take the time to click and input your questions into the Q&A portal, that makes it much easier for us to find your questions rather than scrolling through the chat. You are welcome to use the chat at any time during the event, as well as input your questions into the Q&A portal anytime during the event. We will get to them at the end after the presentation. If you're interested in any more of our upcoming events with eShaver Booksellers, I have a link for you. Dun, da, da. So much fun, but you have to open the chat. There you are. And also, if you're interested, if you don't already have a copy and you're interested in purchasing a copy of Andrew's book, which is beautiful, here is a link to purchase it through us at eshaverbooks.com. Andrew's books got held up in the port of LA. They just made it to Georgia, we found out, and so we're hopeful to be shipping out your books to you later this week, but we will keep you posted on that. And so I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you guys, and I'm going to make Andrew the host. Dun, dun, dun. Bam. And I will exit.
Okay. Great. Thank you all, everybody. So first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a great joy to be at my hometown bookstore. And it has really been an extraordinary couple of weeks coming out of publication here. The book went into a second printing in advance of publication date. And a piece was out last week in Architects Magazine, just out today in Preservation Magazine. This weekend in the Wall Street Journal, there'll be a double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal weekend, and then on the May issue of Smithsonian, we'll have a lovely piece on this project. So it's been really, I'm grateful to see how it has been embraced. The first photograph has been purchased from this project, and the first museum has inquired about permanent collections. So it's been quite the run. So I'm gonna let me start with sort of an observation. Rosenwald schools are one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. They profoundly reshape America. They profoundly reshape the African American experience, and yet they remain hidden history, and their scope and sweep are largely unknown. So with that, let's see, the host. Okay, there we go. I'm going to share my screen and show you some photographs here from this project. This is a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia, which is in North Georgia. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants in Springfield, Illinois. He grew up across the street from Abraham Lincoln when Lincoln was resident in Springfield. And he rises to become the president of Sears Roebuck and Company, which he leads from 1908 until his death in 1932. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, becomes an educator and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama, known then as Tuskegee Institute. And this portrait of Booker T. Washington hangs above the mantle in the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. This photograph is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt, which commemorates the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. It was at the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt. Now, the two men meet in 1911, and you have to remember 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white school children. And many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And in 1912, the two men create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald schools. And they reach out to the Black communities of the South. And they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, materials, and labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to build bridges that will be a foundation for future progress, and we want these to be public schools. So the white school board has to agree to at least own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. Then Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And from 1912, when the community of Lochapoka begins to raise the funds for what will become the very first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt presides over the dedication of what will be the last Rosenwald School, the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And this program transforms America. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago that have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. And that gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the largest single driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. Congressman Lewis wrote this absolutely glorious introduction to my book about where he discusses not only his first day in an Alabama Rosenwald school, but the role education played in his life and about his belief that education is the cornerstone of democracy. So I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African-American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And the story shocked me. As many of you know, I am a native Savannah. I am actually a 5th generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. And the pillars of this story, Jewish, Southern, progressive, activist, they are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of this story? So I came home and I Googled Rosenwald schools. And what I found was that there were some books on this topic, but there had not been a photographic account of the program. So I set out to do exactly that. And over 3.5 years, beginning in early 2016, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 program states and shot 105 of the remaining Rosenwald schools. There's of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 remain, and only about half of those have been restored. This is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school from about 1915, and it is what is known as a one-teacher school. I also found 2 teacher schools. This is the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia, and 3 teacher schools, the Pleasant Plains School. Notice that those were all 1, 2, and 3 teacher schools, small white clapboard buildings. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Now, of the remaining roughly 500 schools, very few are still in use as educational purposes. In fact, of the 105 schools that I visited, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. This is one of them. Dunbar is a magnet middle school. But many of the others have had to have been adaptively reused. Some have been used as community centers. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters who sold quilts to raise the funds to restore the Pleasant Hill School in Cass County, Texas. And now they gather on most Mondays in the schoolhouse which is now a community center, to quilt. Others have been converted into church halls. Some are museums. This is the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee, which is this beautiful museum space. They've recreated this classroom. But many remain unrestored. And in fact, I came across some schools that had collapsed so recently before my arrival that one was surrounded by emergency fencing and one by yellow caution tape. And there is no question that there's an important component of this story, which is the plea for preservation. Half of the Rosenwald schools that survived have not been preserved. And I believe that these are important centers of history and memory and need to be preserved. But by far the emotional heart of this story was the people that I met along the way. I met former students like Frank and Charles Brinkley in the Cairo School in Sumner County, Tennessee, under this original portrait of Julius Rosenwald that was first hung in the school when the schoolhouse opened in 1923. Frank and Charles Brinkley both attended the school. They went to college. They went to graduate school. Frank Brinkley becomes a high school math and science teacher. His brother Charles becomes a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom went through the Cairo School, all of whom went to college. And among the 6 siblings, they have 10 children, and all 10 children went to college. I also met former teachers like Ellie Damer. This is inside the Bay Springs School. Ellie Damer's husband, Vernon Damer, attended the Bay Springs School. And when it closed in 1958, he turned it into a civil rights center and was later murdered for his activism. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school, went to college, and began a long teaching career, teaching inside the Bay Springs School. Their son, Dennis, has recently restored it and brought it back as a community center once again. I'm going to end on the story of the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. The center of this image is a phonograph from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, Martin begins raising farm animals. He acquires some land. He acquires some more land. Eventually, he acquires 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program comes to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donates 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher is Sophia and Martin's daughter. One of her students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, on the right here holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school. The Williamses went off to college. They came back. They had careers as teachers in Bastrop County, and they are now in the final stages of restoring the Hopewell School as a museum and community center. I found this story time and time again. Students become teachers, become the keepers of the flame of history and memory. You will find that this is a book of photography, and I hope you will spend time with these images, but this is also a book of stories. I found so many compelling stories like this that I have written a story that goes with every photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs. And I think you'll find these stories inspiring. And I think you'll find them moving, and I think you'll come away a little bit more optimistic about the prospect for change in America. I'm going to end on some thoughts related to the title of this book, A Better Life for Their Children. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The Black communities that contributed to these schools, even though they were already being taxed to pay for white schools, they were looking for a better life for their children. And collectively, they changed America for the better. And I think that there's a message to those that are working today for social change and positive change in America that individual actions matter and you can, in fact, change the world. John Lewis ends his introduction, or says in his introduction to this book, that each of us has an obligation, a mission, and a mandate, that when we see something that is not just or not right, we must find a way to get in the way. So I'll end on Congressman Lewis's most fervent call: may we all find our ways to making good trouble. Thank you very much.
Hey, Andrew, how are you?
Great, Wanda, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful book. I got a copy of my book a few weeks ago from eShaver. I ran by and picked it up. Excuse me. And I'm glad mine isn't stuck at the port of LA because I have my actual copy. I wanted this, I have so many questions. I pondered long and hard about where do we even start?
Sure.
And when I knew that you were going to end your presentation with a classroom, which is the cover of the book, of course, I really wanted to start there. A typical classroom, what is it? What were the features of a typical classroom? And the reason I ask is because I'm looking at the light and I found a quote, and I think it was Eugene Robinson, the Washington Post columnist and MSNBC commentator. And Eugene and I worked at the Washington Post together, so I know him. And so I was really struck by something he said. I think it was Eugene who said, he just loved coming to school every day. And the thing that he remembers the most is the light in the classrooms. And so I see the light fixtures and I see the windows. So if you could just kind of walk us through before we move on with what a typical classroom was like.
So these schools we're in the progressive era, and this was architecture intentionally in the service of education. And so the schools have certain architectural features that are laid out at the very beginning of the program. And let me just add something that's really an important part of the narrative. These schools were designed by a design team at Tuskegee led by Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first graduate of MIT, African-American graduate of MIT, and the first accredited African-American architect. And the principles that they lay out include the following: very large banks of very large windows, because to let in lots of light, because most of these schools did not start with electrification. Secondly, they had, so the windows could be open to ventilate, cross ventilation as well. And they were warmed by potbelly stoves. In the back of this image, you see the brick chimney and the potbelly stove. Behind me, when I'm taking this picture, are these cloakrooms. Each of the schools had cloakrooms, so the dirty outer garments could be left out and kept out of the educational spaces. The educational spaces could be left cleaner. And the last thing that you see here that's significant is this partial room divider between the classroom on the right and what is another classroom on the left. What divided those rooms was a series of doors that could be closed to separate the two classrooms, but folded back so that the unified space could be a community center after education hours. So these schools were designed not just as schools, but actually as community centers. And that basic architectural idiom persists throughout the entire program.
And I'm looking to the side because I have my book standing up over here and it's bigger. And I remember you mentioned the quilt, and I see, is that the same quilt?
That is,
with
in
the
fact,
picture of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald.
That is the quilt hanging in the back of that room there. Yes, it is.
That's amazing. And I love the floors, the wooden floors and the wooden ceiling. It's just such a beautiful photograph.
There's so many elements of the American flag, the school bell on the desk, the globe in the back of the room. I mean, it's there's a lot here. And I'll add one more thing, that there were always two architectural versions of these schools, one for east-west orientation and one for north-south orientation based on the light. And I discovered this little quirk in the design, that they were supposed to be oriented so that the light would come across the left shoulder of the students so that it would not cast a shadow while they were writing. And I immediately thought, that assumes that everybody's right-handed.
Right, exactly.
a bias of that era, and that bias did not escape the design of Rosenwald schools.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, that's beautiful. I think
I'll
you're going
come
to
off-
unshare.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'll come
great.
off I'll to share a screen here so we can focus.
Good, good. So let's start at the beginning with John Lewis's beautifully written foreword. You live in Atlanta, where John Lewis, of course, served as congressman. So I assume you knew each other, but I really would love the backstory on how it came to be that John Lewis wrote this, and how long before he passed away did he complete this?
Yeah, boy, that's an incredible story. So, look, John Lewis is, you actually, I failed to say this earlier. You mentioned Gene Robinson. Eugene Robinson attended a Rosenwald school in Central South Carolina. Congressman Lewis went to a Rosenwald school that's well known in the historical literature. And I grew up in Savannah. I left the South after high school. I went bouncing around the world for 15 years. But I moved back to Atlanta 26 years ago, and I've lived in the 5th Congressional District the entire time. So I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis for 25 years. As you mentioned, I've been very involved in the civic life of Atlanta. I've been very involved in the nonprofit community and very involved in the political life. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and asked him if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, look, I don't know that much about the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. So I'm not sure I should really be writing the history of Rosenwald schools. And I said to him, I said, Congressman Lewis, there's 3 other essays in this book. Jeannie Syriac at the State Historic Preservation Office has written an essay. Brent Leggs, who leads the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, that leads African American Preservation of the National Trust, has written an afterword. I have an essay in the book. We don't need anybody else to write about the history of Rosenwald schools. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? And tell us about the role that education played in your life. And he's like, oh, I can do that. And so I found myself on October 29th, 2019, in his office, working with him on his introduction, taking his portrait. And it was exactly 2 months later that he announced he had pancreatic cancer. And I'll add one more thing. His staff had said to me earlier, can we do this photograph in his Atlanta office? And I said no, because it was important to me in all of my portraits. The setting is an important part of the narrative in the portraits. And I wanted this to be in his Washington office because it's a statement of achievement and a statement of power. And there's one other thing I'll add. I never told anybody what to wear, any of the people in the portraits, what to wear or how to look into the camera, because I wanted them to have agency in that relationship. And
Sure.
Congressman Lewis is wearing on his lapel a breast cancer awareness pin. And he says to me, should I take this ribbon off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I am here for the authentic you, and that is authentically you. Do not take the ribbon off. And then 2 months later, we find out about his diagnosis.
Okay. Well, I lived in Alabama for 9 years, and he's a proud man from Alabama. So it was just wonderful to hear him describe going to school, working on the farm, and then as I got through the book, I learned that so many of the students went to these schools, and they were created because the children were working on the farm, and they really weren't getting much of an education. 3 months out of the year, if they were kind of lucky.
Well, so the school calendar, particularly for African Americans, the school calendar across the South was adjusted based on the agricultural calendar. But over time, it really became an issue for African Americans because the white farms had workers, and the white children were able to stay in school. And Congressman Lewis actually very specifically writes about this in his introduction, about how at certain times of the year they had to help harvest, and so the school days were shortened in certain cases. But what happens later in the program is that the Rosenwald Fund realizes that some of these things are happening, and it starts to shift its resources in the program starting in 1928 away from just building new schools into incentivizing the educational outcomes. And so they start actually giving bonuses to incentivize longer school years.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. Um, the, I know they were very close, and I also know during the civil rights movement, the Jewish community really supported Dr. King and the civil rights movement. You know, there were many trips to New York City, especially during the, I know from living in Alabama during the bus boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott, there were many trips to go to New York to get money to build a transportation system, for example.
Yeah.
And so here we are in this very important week in our American history after the verdict yesterday and the celebration of the conviction. And I wonder, is this relationship between Washington and Julius Rosenwald a sort of a social template that could be replicated for our current times? Because it just makes me think about their relationship and how important it was for everybody to come together last year as those protests were going on. You know, what was that relationship like? And do you see that as a sort of a social template for our times?
So let me put it into an historical context first. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington meet on May 18th, 1911. And I say that because the 110th anniversary of their meeting is coming up next month. And at this point, Julius Rosenwald has already started experimenting with philanthropy in support of the African American community. And he is motivated by he is very clear, he is motivated by his Judaism. His parents fled religious persecution in Germany, and he's very clear that he sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, for which he is deeply appreciative, but he sees America's role as a safe haven undermined by its treatment of African Americans. And he says, I do not see how America, I'm paraphrasing, I do not see how America can go forward if half her people are left behind. And so that is a clear motivation for him. Booker T. Washington has come to Chicago to ask Julius Rosenwald to join the board of Tuskegee, which he agrees to do. And in February of 1912, he joins the board of Tuskegee, but the two of them keep talking. And that's what leads to this idea of what becomes Rosenwald Schools, and that they also very clearly develop this deep and abiding friendship. There's a lot of correspondence between the two men. And there is no question, this is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews. And there's a direct connection, I believe, between that relationship, the relationship between Dr. King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marches arm in arm with King and who famously says that when he was marching with King, it felt like his feet were praying, to just what happened in Georgia earlier this year. For 2 months, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, a Jewish filmmaker and an African-American pastor, crisscrossed the state together. And you can see that they were doing that not just as political allies, they were doing it as deep friends. And the Ossoff-Warnock relationship stands on the shoulders of both Dr. King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and on Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. And so, these two men, at a fractious time in American history, reach across divides of race, of divides of religion, and divides of region, all of which remain fractious in America today. And they chose hope, they chose optimism, and I think therein is the kernel of this relationship today.
Absolutely. So it really could be a template for what could be, the future of our conversations. And I have been for many, many years a proponent of conversations about race across cultures.
Yes.
And I see this book as one that you could really share with different cultural groups and really sit down together and use it as a jumping off point to talk about the relationship we have across cultures. Because I know I grew up in Savannah. I was educated in public schools. I had never heard of the Rosenwald School.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm learning the story. And I started hearing a little bit about it a few years ago, but I really didn't understand the depth of it, of course, until I read your book. And so I guess I wonder, is that one of your hopes for this book, that people will use this as sort of a conversation starter about how we can work together?
Yeah, I think, look, history has many lessons, and we need to know our history better, and we need to know our hidden history better. But I think that I think that there is that this the we often believe that problems are intractable, particularly in America, problems associated with race. And what this story shows at its core is that individual actions matter. Individual actions can drive change. But I'll add one other thing, and that is, for all of John Lewis's experiences, he was a deeply optimistic person. And he would famously say, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime. And I say that because at their core, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington were both deeply optimistic in America. They were playing long ball. They had a long-term view. And I think it's incumbent upon us from this story, and yes, I hope this story will be a statement, or will remind everybody that to be optimistic in America, to fight for the future of America, but to play long ball and to recognize it's the work of a lifetime.
Absolutely. I'm seeing some questions that are popping in, and we're going to get to those in just a minute, but I do have just a few more questions for you. I want to get a little bit back to the book, the actual production of the book. So you said in your introduction that you drove, what was it, 25,000 miles?
25,000 miles. I would say I added it all up at the end, and I thought I thought my math was wrong, because I couldn't have possibly driven 25,000 miles, but I drove 25,000 miles.
What was that like, going into these various communities? And as a photographer, were there any restrictions on your access? Obviously, you could photograph the outside, but how did you get access to some of these facilities?
Yeah, so I knew from the very beginning this was an incredible story. The question was, how do you tell it visually? And there was not a clear answer to that question. And so I started out, my earlier photography book had been published. The exhibition of those photographs was traveling around the South. And I'll just digress to say that there will be an exhibition of these photographs. It opens May 22nd in Atlanta at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and will be up through December 12th. And then it travels from there for a number of years. So I had an exhibition traveling, and so so we went to the Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is in the old Woolworths, where the lynch counter sit-in movement begins February 1st, 1960. And I would go online and I would research Rosenwald schools, and I would find their GPS coordinates, and I would line them up, and I would shoot schools all the way up. I would hang the exhibition. I would come back. I'd shoot schools all the way back. 4 months later, I'd go back and take the exhibition down and come to do the whole thing again. I started with exteriors. And it was very clear early on, as I got into it, that story was incomplete. And because the exteriors tell the architectural narrative, but I needed to tell the adaptive reuse narrative. And that meant getting inside, and that meant asking permission. And so I had to start to track down, how do you get into these schools? And I'll give you a really good, I showed you earlier the photograph of Frank and Charles Brinkley, the brothers in the Cairo School. So the way I got into that school is that school was I found it online. It happened to be an architectural model that was common in the program, but at the time I had not shot yet. And so I wanted to go there. And I found it was being restored, and there was one of those signs up of announcing the restoration with all the partners that were involved. And I called the architect and said, I would like to get inside the school. And they said, oh, you need to talk to Frank Brinkley. And that's how I met Frank Brinkley, and that's how I got inside the school. And that's how I ended up meeting the people and realizing that their stories were the emotional heart of this narrative. And so, and I was able to bring them in through the portraiture.
So you really didn't start thinking about this as a project of people. It really was the schools and how the schools operated, and the facility itself, and the education process, and the people came. That's a wonderful way to get at it. This event is going to be archived on the eShaver site somewhere, on the Facebook or somewhere. And so I would imagine you're gonna have some professional photographers viewing this. And so one of the questions that I guess if I've managed some photographers, a lot of photographers in my life as a newspaper editor. And so they're always interested in the technical aspects. And of course you did this in black and white. Your other book, Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color, the story of the Morris Brown book before this one, was in black and white. So first, the decision to do black and white, I assume it replicates the time because it was a time of black and white, but it's a very haunting kind of photography that you have done. You know, the skies are dark. The people are not smiling. They're authentic, but they're not smiling. The topic is not a happy topic because it really does harken back to a time of hardship and segregation and children who really needed an education, but it was very difficult. So what were some of the technical aspects of shooting a project like this? And how did you shoot it? What kind of camera did you use?
Yeah, so I use a Nikon D800. All of these images were shot with small apertures all of it shot on tripod, all of it shot on with small apertures so that we have maximum depth of field. And with the digital kind of camera that I'm using, there's a very large sensor, and so when the exhibition opens, for example, the prints are enormous. Or they're 20 inches by 30 inches, which is a very large photographic print, and it just gives you exquisite detail. To your point, all of my earlier book was in color. My previous bodies of work have been in color. But as I was starting to work on, my process is to read and shoot and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting and the shooting informs the reading. And very early on, I came across this incredible story that the Rosenwald Schools program begins with a pilot of 6 schools close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on them. And he has photographs taken of the students and teachers proudly standing in front of their schools, and he sends them to Julius Rosenwald. And Rosenwald writes back that he is so moved by these images that he wants to expand the program. So photography actually plays an active role in the history of this program. And those images of students and teachers in front of their schools, I showed one earlier, become a feature of the visual language and the visual history of this program. And so it was in honor of those that I chose to shoot this entire body of work, not just in black and white, but horizontal, because those images are all horizontal. So that's how this came together.
Great. Well, I would love to see the exhibit because the photograph sounds exquisite. So for someone who has been around photography all my life, I'm not a photographer, but been around it. It sounds wonderful. It was enlightening to read that some of the facilities were not schools, they were teacher homes. Mm-hmm. And so I assume that in some cases they didn't have a teacher right there in the community, so they had to recruit teachers from other communities. So what do you know about that? And also, are any of those homes still standing? Were you able to see them? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Rosenwald Fund builds 4,970, contributes to 4,978 schools. They also built another roughly 350 buildings, a couple hundred industrial education shops, which we would now call VOTEC, were built to supplement the classroom spaces for technical education, and about 150 or so teachers' homes. I did find some of each. I actually only found one of these. The Jefferson Jacobs School in Eastern Kentucky has one of those industrial shops behind it. I came across 2 schools in Alabama that still have the surviving teachers' homes. But to me, of all of those, and you'll see sometimes in the history, you'll hear 5,300 schools. It's actually really 5,300 structures because it's 4,978 schools. I decided to just sort of simplify the narrative and focus on the schoolhouses because that's That's the sort of civic center of the story. But yes, the fund was very innovative in responding to the local need. And so, yeah, there were places where they needed to have a teacher's home so that they could bring the appropriate teacher in. There's other places I mentioned earlier where they incentivize longer school years. Toward the end of the program, they're incentivizing brick construction because they realize these buildings need to last longer than the wooden buildings are lasting in the South. And there's even places where they start to subsidize buses.
Oh, okay.
In libraries. In the later phase of the program, they're also funding libraries, which are libraries really sort of a cabinet of books in the schools, but still a library.
So I don't want to get too far off track, but as I was reading, I was wondering if many of these wooden structures burned because of any racial strife, or is it just the nature of wooden buildings with pot-bellied stoves that at some point there's going to be a spark and they're going to burn?
Yeah, so the architecture of Rosenwald schools is deliberately modest. And it's modest for two reasons. One reason it's modest is to save cost. The other reason it's modest is to prevent backlash, otherwise known as arson. There is a number of the schools that I came across, there is a history of them having burned. So for example, there's a story related to the Brevard School in Brevard, North Carolina. The school on that site today is actually the second school. The first one burned. The Lochapoka School, which was the very first Rosenwald school, it burns in 1960. There's the school, George Wolfe, the Broadway producer, who's now up for an Oscar for having directed Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. He went to a school that was the third school on its site on the campus of Kentucky State University. The first two burned. Now, is there any evidence that those burnings were specifically arson? I have not seen that in the literature, but the risk certainly is there, and the inference is certainly there.
Yeah, I just wondered about it. I know that from having attended an HBCU, Spelman College, and living and working in Savannah, that these laboratory schools at HBCUs are very common. And I did reach out to a librarian at Savannah State, Jennifer West, who has the question, which of the remaining Rosenwald schools are closest to Savannah? So there was one on Savannah State's campus that Rosenwald contributed to after the first structure, as I understand it. But are there any others that are close to Savannah or were close to Savannah?
Powell Hall on the campus of Savannah State was originally a Rosenwald school. It burned at some point, and so most of what's there today is a reconstruction. But if you look at the wall that faces the direction of the football stadium, it's that large bank of windows and is unmistakably Rosenwald in its design. But it's not, it otherwise does not really look like a Rosenwald school. There are the schools, there is apparently one in Brunswick, but I did not actually go there. But there's several in Central Georgia. There's a Rosenwald school on the campus of Fort Valley State University that is actually in my book. There's one in Cusseta, Georgia, which is just south of Fort Valley, and another one in Chattahoochee County, the Friendship School, that's also in my book. And the very last one was in Warm Springs.
Okay, I think the one in Brunswick that you may be referring to is the one on St. Simon's Out, the Harrington School?
No, it's not.
That may be, it's not the Harrington School.
Harrington School is not. The Harrington
not
School is a historically Black school, but is not actually a Rosenwald school.
Okay. Okay.
One feature of the Rosenwald Fund was that they made their architectural plans available to anybody for free. And so there were actually thousands of schools built with the architectural plans from the Rosenwald Fund, both white schools and Black schools that are not technically Rosenwald schools because they didn't receive Rosenwald funding. But this program ended up contributing to the construction of many, many more schools beyond just the Rosenwald schools. Apparently, the one in Brunswick is actually a brick building, but I understand it's boarded up, but I didn't visit that one.
Okay. And so while you're mentioning the Black schools and the white schools, it's my understanding from reading your book that the schools were turned over to the school system, and they had to pay for everything else. They hired the teachers, maintained the school. So the Rosenwald money really was just for construction. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. And the Black community had to contribute to the school, and those contributions can, as I said, could come in cash, land, labor, material. But the white school board had to agree. The white school board was encouraged to contribute, but was not required to contribute. But they did have to agree to own the school, maintain the school, and pay for the teachers. And Congressman Lewis references this in his introduction when he says the only public money that came our way was the teacher's salary. But what ends up happening is in the early part of the program, almost all of the money is coming from Rosenwald and the Black community. But about toward the end of the program, what starts to happen is Julius Rosenwald's contribution is seen as political cover. And so the school systems are able to contribute more because they've got that political cover. And in addition, because of the Great Migration, the African-American population is leaving the South. And the white school boards understand that they need to keep their labor force, and they start actually making contributions towards the construction of these schools. So in the later phase of the program, a significant amount of the money actually comes from public funding.
So that's literally keeping them down on the farm. I mean, literally.
Yes, it is.
Keep the farms going. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct.
So what stopped this? What was the point and the reason that there was no longer a need, I guess, for Rosenwald schools?
So what happens is a couple of things that happen. Number one, you have the Supreme Court desegregation orders of 54 and 55 that come out of the Brown case. And one of the things that you'll see with these images is that I have a very specific nomenclature. I have the name of the school because the names are just poetic, right? Sometimes they're named after a person in the community. Sometimes they're named after the church next door. Sometimes they're named after a geographic feature. And so you have the name of the school, you have the county and the state, because all the public funds flowed through county school boards. Then you have the opening date, but you also have the closing date. And what I wanted to show with the closing date was that the response to Brown v. Board varied radically, not just by state, but by individual jurisdiction. So there are Rosenwald schools that close right after Brown. There are other Rosenwald schools that remain open until deep into the 1960s. But then what happens is when the schools close in part because they are smaller schools. I have some data in my book about the density of the schools. There's counties that had 20 and 30 Rosenwald schools because they were so small. But the reason that you have that dispersed smaller structures is that the Black community was not given school buses. And so they had to walk to school. Well, then in an era of integration where you have school buses, you end up with larger consolidated schools, and these smaller structures become outdated as schoolhouses. And so that contributes to it as well.
Okay. And some of the photographs I saw were just pictures of rubble.
Yeah, well, I wanted to show that, there are some, look, I find that there is beauty in, architecture tells lots of different stories, right? Architecture can tell a story of time because it's changed architectural style. But architecture also tells time by the face of aging and weathering and the force of elements. And I find these deteriorated buildings to be beautiful, but at the same time, they are a call for preservation. These are perishable resources, and if we don't save them, they will fall apart. And so when I came across those schools that were piles of rubble, I thought this is an important part of the story. I showed up to shoot the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, and it was totally unbeknownst to me, it had been demolished a week before I got there. And it was a pile of rubble, and standing in the middle of this pile of rubble is the Coke machine. Like, you can't make this stuff up, but it's got this yellow caution tape around it. And it's like, yeah, this is what happens when we don't act when we have time. This is what was happening to downtown Savannah before the historic restoration movement made Savannah the jewel that it is today.
Absolutely. So this is really a wonderful book project. And, this is the epitome of what we call a coffee table book, because it is a book you want to leave out so that when you have guests come, you pull it out and you talk, you read a little bit of it and you talk about it and you share it with people and you share it with your children and your grandchildren. So as writers and as authors, we're always looking for the next best project. So how did this book make you a better person and or a better photographer?
Well, the first thing I would say is, and I'm fond of saying this, and it's been true in everything any photography undertaking I've ever done. At the beginning, there are projects, I do projects, and at the end of every project, I am a better photographer than I was at the beginning of the project. What you learn varies from project to project, but it is a continuous learning process, which of course makes it a great joy. But I think in terms of what I learned from this project, I go back to something that I said earlier. I'd say two things. First of all, I was what I found time and again in the people that I met is this continuum between somebody who starts out as a student in one of these schools, becomes a teacher, and then becomes this leader in history and memory in their community. And I think that it is a reminder of the central, the story, one of the stories that binds my first book and my second book is this notion that education has been the backbone of the American dream since before there was the United States of America. And from the American commitment, the commitment to public education, which goes back more than 375 years in this country, to the land grant colleges in the 1862 and the historically Black colleges in the decades after the Civil War, the Rosenwald schools, the educational provisions of the GI Bill, Brown v. Board, and yet today we are talking about college affordability and college access and crushing levels of student debt. Education is an on-ramp to the middle class, and that is a tradition, American tradition at risk. And I think that's a really, really important story. And I was certainly reminded of that. But to go back to the heart of your question, what did I learn? This is something I referenced earlier, but the thing that stands out to me more than anything else is optimism. It didn't become apparent to me until I was working with John Lewis on the introduction of this book that this is how often he talked about optimism. Be hopeful, be optimistic. And it was then that helped me realize the inherent optimism of playing. And you are building schools for a challenged population that has not had educational access, where their education was prohibited during slavery. Absolutely. Literacy was prohibited during slavery. And to play a game that will take decades to play out takes incredible persistence and optimism. And I think that idea that play long ball, be optimistic, that's to me the central takeaway from this journey.
Well, since you're talking about the money that was invested, one of the questions we have in the Q&A is there anything more you can say about why Rosenwald was motivated to spend his money this way? We know he had the relationship with Booker T. Washington, but was he trying to spend more money, not just with the schools, but in other ways? He is described as a philanthropist. So describe philanthropist vis-a-vis Julius Rosenwald.
Yeah, so Rosenwald was an incredibly innovative philanthropist. So first of all, he basically is one of the first people to initiate what really are challenge grants. And his challenge grants predate Rosenwald schools. Remember, he meets Booker T. Washington in 1911, but in 1910, the leaders of the YMCA in Chicago come to him and say, we would like to build a new YMCA for the Black community, and we'd like you to contribute. And he shocks them with two statements. Number one, he says, I will contribute $25,000 to a new YMCA if the rest of the community, Black and white, will raise another 75. So he's done challenge grants 2 years before the Rosenwald Schools program starts. And then he says, and by the way, I'll do that in any major American city. I'll make you this exact same offer. And over time, 24 YMCAs are built with that model, including the Butler Street Y in downtown Atlanta, which has all kinds of history, as you well know, tied to the civil rights movement. So he's got challenge grants. He's got public-private partnership. Remember, the school boards have to be part of this program. And he has this innovation that says he wants all the money to be given away within X number of years of his death. Bill Gates has said that today. Warren Buffett has said that. Bernie Marcus has said that. It's very fashionable in philanthropy today. That starts with Julius Rosenwald. But what happens is, so Julius Rosenwald dies in 1932, and he is eulogized by the likes of James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Alain Locke. And Alain Locke, the intellectual force of the Harlem Renaissance, writes that the heart of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy was his understanding that people need to be partners in their own progress. And he lauds Rosenwald for having, and Washington for having created together this model where there is dignity in the active participation in one's path upward. And so I think that all of those things are to be celebrated in his philanthropic model.
Okay. Another question from our audience is, here's one about the schools itself, the education. How many grades, or what was the range of ages that were being taught in these buildings?
Yeah, so it's complicated because it varies widely by school and by location. What we do know is that in each of these schools, there were multiple classes taught in one classroom. So, for example, in the school that Congressman Lewis went to, there were 2 rooms and there was 2 teachers. One teacher was teaching, I think, grades 1 through 4, and the other was teaching grades 5 through 8. A lot of these schools were focused on that sort of elementary and what we back then would have been called junior high. And then they had other school, and that was really a lot of people only went that far in the educational model of the times. People that wanted to go to high school, they had this slightly larger buildings that served a larger geographical area, and they were called county training schools. What county training schools was a euphemism kind of for high school. And it was called a county training school because it sort of said to the white community that this was really about vocational education, industrial education. But in fact, they had classical education, and it was this sort of model that hid the rigors of the curriculum.
And there is another question that's kind of long, so I'm trying to pare it down. This is written by someone who identifies herself as a historic preservation planner in Florida, and she fell in love with the Rosenwald story after working in Fernandina Beach, Florida.
Yeah.
She says, I'm aware of the National Trust efforts around the schools and attended the conference in 2015. I'm curious if you came across any state level programs actively working to survey, document, and encourage preservation of these schools. And that was actually a question I was gonna sort of have toward the end as well. What's happening now to preserve what is left? And I think you said there are 500 structures.
There's about 500 left. Only about half of those have been restored. So let me just quickly say to Fernandina, the Peck School in Fernandina is in this book. It has a glorious story. There's not only a photograph of this beautiful 2-story red brick building, but a portrait of the people who who were classmates in 1959, in the class of 1949 in that school, and who I'm proud to be that they're in the book. And I'm going to be at the bookstore in Fernandina sometime this summer doing an actual physical non-virtual talk. There are a number of efforts to try to preserve some of these schools. You are correct that the National Trust in 2002 designated Rosenwald schools as collectively a historic resource at risk, and that brought a lot of attention and brought resources and has been very instrumental in helping preserve a number of schools, and a number of schools have been preserved with grants from the National Trust. So the first thing I would say is, at the National Trust level, Brent Leggs heads up under the umbrella of the National Trust, the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is focused not just on Rosenwald schools, but preserving all sites of African American history. And the incredible statistic that Brent quotes is that there's 95,000 places listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Only 2% celebrate African American heritage. And so one way to support these schools is to contribute to the to the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. At the state level, there are these state organizations. In Georgia, it's the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. I do know that to specifically answer the question, Virginia, I've actually heard from somebody at the Virginia equivalent of, I think it's Preserve Virginia, that is actually right now doing an active survey of surviving Rosenwald schools as an inventory to get started on preservation. And similar efforts have been undertaken in other states. And then there's also local efforts. I know that in the Florida Panhandle, for example, there's a local community that is coming together to try to raise money to preserve their Rosenwald school. And so there's opportunities to support this preservation at both at the national, at the state, and the local level.
So that's great information. And speaking of information, I want to thank you for the resources that you put in the back of the book, because it's a very handy guide to just go there and see other places that you can learn about Rosenwald schools. And I think as an author, that was a very generous thing to do, to point them in different directions, whether it's documentaries or books or articles. So that was a very good thing. So what do you want to leave us with today? What is the overarching thing you want us to sort of, you know how you leave a musical and you sort of skip out singing the main song, you know, the theme is in your head for a few hours. What do you want us to think about as we wrap up our evening and, you know, go about having dinner or calling a friend and say, guess what I just learned?
Yeah.
So
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, this is a, let me just say, first of all, thank you for joining this conversation. It's been lovely to talk with you. I thank Shavers for hosting this this evening. I think this is a book of photography, and I hope people will spend time with the images because I think they will find them moving and inspiring. But I also hope that they'll spend time with these stories. These stories tell of Rosenwald School's connections to this extraordinary fabric of American history. There's a school directly connected to the Trail of Tears, directly connected to an incredible story that synopsizes the Great Migration. There's a school connected to the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is so present today in our culture as we think about reticence for vaccination in the African American community. And so those stories, I think, folks will find really powerful. But I go back to some of the things that we've talked about in this conversation. Change is hard, but change happens. But it only happens when we're on the battlefield, and we have to stay. And there is this moment in American history, which I think colors some of our history, which is Dr. King talking about that he has seen the promised land. He has been to the mountaintop and he has seen the promised land, and it causes us to think that we will get to this promised land. But there is always evil in the world. It is not going away. And democracy is an active entity, and it requires that we continuously engage in the continuous work of making our country better and making our culture better. And so, no, we don't get to stop. We have to keep working. And to that central message, the work of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald show us that when we reach across these chasms of race and religion and region and whatever the chasms are, today it may be party or maybe class, we can change the world, we can make a difference, but we have to stay at it because we cannot, our democracy requires our continued active participation.
Well, that's wonderful. So I want to thank E. Shaver for bringing us together. We are closer than we think, even though we're in Savannah and Atlanta. I want to thank those who were participating and who asked wonderful questions today. But I want to thank you most of all for sort of bringing us to this point to think about issues that are very important and to leaving a legacy really for us to start conversations and continue conversations. And I really, I'm sure that you're going to have a successful book tour as well as the exhibition. And are you going to show any of your photos in the Savannah area? Do you know that that's in the
they may come to Savannah at some point in the future. I would certainly welcome that. Right now, the exhibition, the schedule is booked through the end of 2023.
Okay.
After it leaves Atlanta, it goes to the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Then it goes to the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, which is working with Fisk University, where the Rosenwald Fund archives are, because the office was in Nashville. It will go to the Charlotte Museum of History, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, and then the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. And I'm also talking to museums in Washington, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco.
So as we are post-COVID, if that's a thing, we will pay attention to your schedule, and maybe we will go to you instead of you coming to us. By that I mean your photographs. But thank you so much. I think I'm ready to turn it back over to Annie, and she can close us out.
Great.
All righty. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Andrew and Wanda, thank you for a brilliant discussion. I learned so much tonight. It was amazing. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you have a lovely, wonderful, safe evening. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. And Andrew, you're the host, so if you'll go ahead and end the evening for us, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.